Hi, I'm Ali Board and I'm the author of A Beginner's Guide to Watercolour with Mixed Media, published by the fabulous Search Press. It came out at the beginning of 2020 and 2020 was supposed to see me do lots of publicity and demonstrations and appearances to promote my book, but sadly, due to the unprecedented circumstances, of course, that isn't going to happen. Now, Search Press have given me the most incredible opportunity. I was supposed to be appearing at Patchings this year, but instead of that, Search Press have very kindly allowed me to do 2 broadcasts. This one, which is pre-recorded, and a live session that we were going to show on Facebook during the duration of Patchings. Today, I'm going to share with you a little bit of a different project for me, something small, which I don't tend to normally do, but hopefully that will impart some of my favourite techniques as we are going to tackle a painting of some pebbles. First of all, I'd like to take you through the reference material that I'm going to be working from today. This is a photograph that I took myself in South Wales on a beach called White Sands Beach, and the colours and the textures in these pebbles just fascinated me. And I loved the repetition, the shadows, there were all sorts of things that appealed to me. The scary thing about tackling a photograph like this is the fact that there's so much of it. So what I've actually done is crop it down so that I'm just concentrating on a little bit of it. And here's my cropped version. You can see that really concentrating on those textures on the pebbles, those lovely, rich, deep, dark shadows, and the myriad of colours that switch between a pale blue, a golden yellow, and a dark grey. Let's take you through some of the materials that I'm going to be using today. I've kept it quite simple because we're going to need all of our attention focused on our subject matter, but here's a few of the things that I'm going to be using. One of the things that I'm going to be using for texture is this product, which is Gesso. This is traditionally used for priming oil and acrylic canvases, but it does have a really unusual effect on watercolour in that it partly repels it and partly accepts the colour over the surface. And I'm going to be applying that with an old brush in various ways to see if I can replicate the texture of my pebbles. The gesso that I'm using is made by Pebbles, but the brand of your gesso is not going to affect the outcome of your painting in any way. Every brand has a different consistency, and so you just need to experiment. The Pebbles is a really reasonably priced one though, that's why I like it. I'm going to be using some really beautiful brushes. These are some of my favourite brushes. These are the SAA's Imitation Sable brushes. So these are designed to have all the water and colour holding properties of a traditional natural hairbrush, but without the cost concerns or any concerns regarding animal welfare. So I've got a 10, a 6 and a 4. That's basically a relatively large, it's not too big, a medium and a small one for getting into those nooks and crannies in my pebbles. I've got a pencil, a putty eraser, and then I've got 2 things that are the star of the show. Obviously I've got a pot of water, kitchen roll and a palette. But the first thing I want to talk about are the colours that I'm going to use. Now the 3 colours that I'm going to use today are Quinacridone Gold, Cerulean Blue and Jane's Grey. The brand of the paints that I am using is Daniel Smith, but again the success of your painting is not going to stand and fall on whether you have Daniel Smith paints or not. I particularly prefer the Daniel Smith paints because I think they are some of the best that money can buy, and I love the quality of their pigments. They spend an awful lot of time and resources making sure that the pigments are really beautifully clean, and you can see examples of them there. I don't use pans, I don't use the little blocks squeezed out. I find it very difficult to get enough colour from the surface of those. But if I use tubes and I squeeze the colour fresh out onto my palette, I personally find that consistency to be a little bit too sticky for my liking, and I struggle to load up my brush in a way that I find suitable for my painting requirements. So I actually squeeze my colours straight out into empty pans and then I allow them to dry. And all I do before I start is to give them a bit of a spritz with a water bottle and they come good. It also means because my painting style isn't an awful lot of colour mixing, I can pick these little blocks up and I can transfer them over to my working area so that I can put colour straight on the page. That's just a style of painting that I prefer. Also, just in case I need it, I have some white gouache here. I use white gouache an awful lot to bring back any of the highlights. Now, you may choose to mask out your pebbles. There's lots of ways that you could attack this project, but I'm going to do it by adding a few little highlights at the end. White gouache used to be called body colour, and it did just that. It adds body to watercolour, which tend to be on the thin and translucent side. So I'm going to be able to pop my whites back in with this. In gouache, there tend to be two whites. There tend to be zinc white and permanent white. I'm using the permanent white because that is the whitest of all the whites. So there's my little selection of equipment that I'm going to be using. I'm going to be drawing from that into my project as I go along. So here is my project, all drawn out ready onto watercolour paper. I'm using Saunders Waterford 300 gram knot surface. So that means that it's not smooth and it's not rough. It lies somewhere in the middle of those two. And it's not particularly heavy. If you've got a heavier one, that's fine. If you've got a lighter weight one, that's fine also. And you may notice, if you look at it in relation to the size of my hands, that it's actually quite a small piece of paper. I just want to keep today's project really, really simple. Now I've torn my piece of watercolour paper. One of the edges was already had a decal on it, the way that this particular paper is made, so it's got this lovely rough edge. And then I've torn the other edges to sort of match it. I have got a cut one at the top, but I've put that at the top because this way of presenting a painting I actually really enjoy, just something small, and then if it works out I've got lots of different ways that I can be mounting it, but we might talk about more of that towards the end of the project. I've drawn out onto my paper my pebble shapes, and all I've done is concentrate on the outline of them. It's very difficult when you do a subject like this to get distracted by the shadows because they create their own shape, but I need to add those back in with the paint, and so all I am concentrating on are the overall shapes of the pebbles themselves. Now, one of the first things I want to tackle is the texture of my pebbles. And to do that, I'm going to add gesso to them. Now, like I said in the introduction to the materials, gesso is something that's actually going to slightly repel my watercolour. So I need to look very carefully at where the highlights are going to occur on my pebbles and place the gesso in such a way that it's going to beautifully start to push my colour around and create those textures. Let's take you back to the overhead shot of my materials. Here I've got a ceramic palette. I tend to prefer ceramic palettes because I find them easy to clean, and when they do get a bit gunked up I actually pop them in the dishwasher. Plastic palettes are absolutely fine, but I do tend to find that watercolour and other things does stain them, so a ceramic palette is the one that I prefer if I've got to use one at all. And here is my gesso. This is in a tube. You may have gesso in a tub. Either way, it doesn't matter. I'm going to squeeze a little bit of it out onto my ceramic palette, and you can see how white it is in comparison. Look how bright that is against the ceramic palette surface. Then I'm going to use a brush. This is one of the SAA's silver brushes. I tend to use these for acrylic painting. This is one that I've used for glue and all sorts, so it's kind of been retired. It's not much good to me for painting anymore, but it's going to be perfect for applying the gesso to the surface. And the first thing I'm going to do is dip that brush into the gesso, coat it really nicely with colour, so that I've got plenty to play about with when I put it onto my painting surface. So if we go back to our rocks, I have the photograph in front of me and you can do the same. What I'm looking for is the lighter areas, and I'm going to use the edge of my brush to tap that texture over the top. It's got that lovely kind of sticky quality. You can even move your hand over the top of your brush to alter the mark that you make. Now, when you get used to applying gesso, it's so very, very tempting to then put gesso on everything, but you have to remember that it is going to partly repel the paint. And so if you put it everywhere, of course, you're going to end up with all of the areas of your pebbles with highlights, when actually in between in some areas, you're going to want some delicious darks. So be very mindful of that. Now this rock here is the biggest one, and it's got a very definite lighter area on the left hand side of it that kind of fades out. into a darker area. I'm trying to move my brush too, because if I make the same repetitive mark, then my shape is going to look mechanical and not nature made. Moving down to this one, I've got a slightly smoother texture on this pebble. It doesn't really matter if you're not replicating the photograph exactly. I'm just looking at some of those patterns and getting some inspiration from them. Now we've got a dark shadow coming down here on this pebble, so I don't really want to interfere with that. And then I'm going to work on this one next, which in the photograph is a little bit smoother, so maybe I'll brush some gesso on very lightly. I'm hardly touching the paper at all, if I'm honest. This one, these two have got much more texture on them. Where am I getting to? I'm not going to put texture on everything because, like I said, if I do that, I'm in danger of everything looking very similar. This pebble here has got lots of pop marks in it, so let's get it on the side and see what marks we can make out of that. They're a bit linear, so there's no reason at all why you can't stick your finger back in it and create some texture that way. That's looking really nice. I'm happy with that. Now this pebble's got a shadow on this side, and so what I'm actually going to do is concentrate my texture towards the edge and the middle, trying to make it as random as I can. Then we've got some paler stones, real dark ones in there, and maybe a little bit more of that gesso in the top right hand corner. Don't need an awful lot. I squeezed out way too much. If you've got it in a tub, you're going to be much more economical with it. Having a quick look, there's no reason at all why I can't add more later, but I think for the time being that I'm finished with that. I'm going to give that a good blast with the hairdryer. So here's my painting. I've given it a really, really good dry. The gesso is quite hard to see now because obviously it's a very similar white to the paper, but it's absolutely imperative that you make it dry completely because you really don't want to be putting your watercolour brushes back into damp gesso. Now, if you do accelerate the drying rather than letting it dry naturally, you may just dry the surface and find that the core of the gesso is not dry. But the best way to test whether it's dry or not, look at that, stick your finger in it. Is anything coming off? No, it's not. And therefore, I know I can paint on it without any worries at all. So the first thing I'm going to do today is I am actually going to lay down a sort of underpainting. I want those yellows that I've got in my photograph, and let me show you those kind of lovely glowing yellows that are coming through. I want those to just sit underneath some of the other colours that I'm going to apply. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wash some Quinacridone Gold over my surface. It's going to be very weak and very pale, but it's going to sit there just as a sort of glowing undertone underneath everything else. So here is my little pan of Quinacridone Gold, and because it has dried under the lights, I'm going to give it a quick spritz with my spray bottle, and that will reconstitute the colour and make it come to life. Now, Quinacridone Gold is an incredibly strong colour, so please do use it with caution. Unless you want a strong yellow, of course. I want something a bit more subtle here today, so I'm only going to use small amounts of it. And actually, to do that, I'm going to lay some water down on my surface first. Now, I'm using the size 10 imitation sable brush, which I've loaded up with water, and because these are the early stages of my painting, I don't need to worry too much about accuracy. So I'm swishing water over the surface just so that I've got some little pockets of water where my Quinacridone Gold can run out into. So let's pop a little bit of that water down. And then into my colour, I'm only just going to tap it ever so lightly on the surface because I don't really want to coat my brush with colour. I don't want it to be that strong. And you'll see straight away when I start to pop it onto the watercolour paper, you see what a fresh and bright colour that is. So I'm going to pop that, not all over, but certainly in some places, and you will start to notice where the gesso is going to repel it. So we had some yellow down in these corners. We've got a little bit of yellow in the foreground too. So let's just tap some of that on the brush and pop some of that colour in. And I'm letting it just kind of run around and do the thing that it likes to do best. And there you go, you can see straight away how that gesso is partly repelling the colour, partly pushing it away, and partly accepting some of it. So I've got a bit of yellow there. I've got a little bit of yellow on this pebble too. and some more up in the top right hand corner. Gosh, that's very bright, and I need to make sure that I blend that out a little bit. Now, if I added my Cerulean Blue, which is the next colour I'm going to apply straight away, what I would get is a green coming through. And whilst there is a little bit of a tinge of green on some of these pebbles, I really don't want it to start interfering with that yellow. So I'm going to give it a really good dry before I continue on to the next step. You can see now that I've dried it just how much that colour shrinks back. So sometimes if you've overdone it a little bit and you look at it in the wet stage and you think, oh my goodness, I think that colour is too strong, it is always worth just hanging out to see whether you're right when it dries, because as you can see, that's dried back a really good 2-3 tones. And what I've got now is this lovely glowing colour going on underneath. And here and there in places, my texture is already starting to work for me, which I'm really, really pleased about. So now I need to do a very similar thing with the cerulean. Now cerulean is a really lovely colour for rocks. Why the funny name? Cerulean is the Latin for sky, and you can see exactly why it has been deemed that colour. So I'm going to wash a blue over the top. I'm going to do it in a similar way. I'm going to start concentrating on some of the pebble shapes, but actually just for the time being, I'm just going to look at the areas that I think are particularly a pale blue. Let's show you that photograph again so you can see what I'm talking about. You wouldn't necessarily have to use cerulean. You could try a cobalt blue or an ultramarine, or you could stick to greys if you wanted to. I just know from previous experience, using that cerulean gives a lovely freshness to my pebbles. So here's my cerulean. I'm going to be a bit more liberal with this colour. Cerulean is quite a weak colour in terms of pigment, so you can, it's not like the quinacridones, you can actually afford to load up your brush a little bit more with colour. So let's start with that one in the middle. So I'm going to wipe some of that cerulean over the top, but I am going to use a blending out technique. And to do that, I'm going to fill my brush with water. I'm going to go back into that cerulean colour and use the water to pull it around. Now, can you see how it is going green over the top of that yellow? But that's okay, that's fine, it doesn't matter. You can always push that back a little bit if you think that it's not looking quite right. Now look how my pebble textures are starting to come through. I'm really pleased with that. This area down here, of course, is all shadow, so I don't need to worry about that for the time being. Let's move that technique over to some of the other shapes. Now be mindful if you're painting shapes next door to each other, that if one is wet, you might have a bleed from one to the other. You can decide whether that is something that you find really exciting or whether that fills you with horror. It's just trial and error, really. I tend to leave a little bit of a gap between my two pebbles, and then I don't have to worry about it so much. So I'm hoping that you can start to see those pebble shapes really appearing. I'm going to make my way around some of the others. Now this one is considerably paler, so I don't want to put too much of the blue down. So let's really wash that out. Made a little bit of a staining mark with my brush. That's fine. That can just be part of the texture. We've got another shape coming down in here. Again, I don't really want much on there. I've got a lovely dark shadow going on in there. Let's put some of the blue on this rock. And again, we can blend that out. What I'm really doing more than anything else is starting to navigate my way around this painting for understanding where all the shapes are. If you wanted to tackle something a little more challenging than this composition, obviously you could have a full page of pebbles, which would look really spectacular, wouldn't it? Now we've got a very blue one here, which I'm going to pop in and use my blending out technique for moving that colour. This one here is actually more yellow than it is blue, so I'm going to leave that one alone. This one's got a little bit of colour on it, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. This one is quite a bluey grey, so let's get some colour on this one. So you can see it doesn't really matter, we're just adding our layers of colour and making our way around our painting. Really quite without stress or worry, and you can see the gesso starting to pop through now. It's doing all the hard work as far as the texture is concerned. Now into That one's a very yellow one, so I need to leave that one alone. This one again is a little bit bluer on the top, so let's pop some of that colour in. And then we've got this one here, which again is more grey than it is anything else, so I think we'll leave that alone. Now while that is all damp, I'm going to take the opportunity to add a little bit more texture, and I'm going to do that through a spatter technique. To do that, you need a brush and something to tap it across. Very important at this stage to understand that you're not going to hit the brush that's got the colour on. You're going to use the brush tapped over the top of something else. If you tap it over the top of something else, the colour will go downwards. If you hit your brush, you'll find that the colour all comes up and you'll end up with coloured freckles. The size of the brush does determine the size of the speckle, so I've actually switched to a size 6 brush for this, and I'm going to load it up with my cerulean, and then tapped back into my picture I can start to get some of that lovely speckled texture in. Now where it's hitting some of the damp patches, we are getting a lovely diffused colour, and where my painting has started to dry under the lights, I've got much more of a pronounced spatter. You could experiment with the depth of colour too, but for me, I just like to get on with it because I know that the next part of what I'm going to be doing is the really exciting part. I am quite tempted, even though this is a recorded version of my demonstration, and it doesn't seem as instant as some of the live demonstrations that I do, I am constantly changing my mind about what it is that I want to do. I hadn't planned on putting any of the quinacridone back in the spatter, but I was just looking at that thinking, actually it could do with a little bit of yellow too, particularly those rocks that I really want to feature the yellow on. So let's get that in too. I'm nothing if not flexible. So we've got that colour on, and again I need to give that a really good dry before we carry on with the darks. So here is my painting all dry now. We've got the layer of the Quinacridone Gold, we've got the layer of the Cerulean Blue, and we've got that lovely speckled texture all going on over the top of our gesso, which we put on earlier. In order to make these pebbles stand out, there is no denying that we need to make sure that the shadows are the thing that sets them off. And this is often the part of a pebble painting that scares people, because you need to make your shadows really dark. And if we go back to our source photograph, you can see that the only reason that those pebbles stand out is the depth of the shadow in all the nooks and crannies, in the crevices, in the cracks and the fissures that really make them come to life. You have other shadows on there too, sides of pebbles that are slightly softer, but we're going to start with the really hard versions of things, and we're going to work backwards from there. So the colour that I'm going to use for that is this one, Jane's Grey. Now Jane's Grey has turned into a real favourite colour of mine. I used to really dislike Payne's Grey, which is probably a colour that you're more familiar with, because I find Payne's Grey very flat and very hard. Now I do like black, and I have mixed black in with other colours often in my paintings. I just find that Jane's Grey is a more subtle alternative. This is a colour that is exclusive to Daniel Smith, but there are ways of achieving it. You can mix together ultramarine and burnt sienna and get something similar. I just have found that in my experiments, I don't really think that there's anything to rival this pre-mixed version, and you don't hear me say that very often. I tend to prefer paints that only have one pigment in them, but there's always exceptions to the rule, aren't there? And Jane's Grey is the one for me. So I've gone to my size 6 imitation sable brush, and I'm going to start with some of the easier shadows. So the ones that are really quite hard, that I am absolutely sure of where they're occurring. I'm going to have my little bit of kitchen roll to one side so that I can control the amount of water on it if I need to. So let's start, actually let's be sensible and start over on the left hand side. So I'm going to fill my brush up with colour, and down in this crack I know that there's a soft shadow on that pebble, but I can quickly see by looking at my photograph that I've got a really deep version down in here. So I'm going to pop the Jane's Grey in. I'm going to go over to my water pot, roll the excess moisture off onto my kitchen towel, and then pull that shadow up and across into that next pebble. So let's get that in. This is a little bit fiddly, but I promise you it's worth it to get that lovely rich shadow going on. So there's my first one. Now this, although this is a pebble in the photograph, it's got a really dark shadow in there, and it's important to get that in so that this pebble comes forwards. So we'll get that colour loaded onto the brush and we will stroke that in really nice and dark. Be brave with that dark. I'm sure that there are some of you out there who are drawing breath in for how deep that shadow is, but you need it to be, otherwise your pebbles are not going to start appearing on your page. So let's blend that, soften that edge a little bit. Can take that up a little bit further. Let's really get rid of any of those hard edges. See, that's looking better already. Already this is starting to stand out. We're nowhere near finished yet. So I'm going to repeat this process across my painting. Let's start with this one up here in this top corner. I need the point of my brush to be able to get that in, and I can pull that colour around that pebble. I'm actually, in the photograph, there's another tiny little pebble in that gap, which I'm actually going to ignore because it's my painting and I can do that if I want to. So let's get that shadow. Yeah, it does go down to this pebble and meets it, and then it kind of slides over the back of this one and comes out the other side. So let's get that colour in that side too. Coming around that shape. Where does that disappear? I'm looking at my photograph the whole time, making sure that I don't start inventing the shadows, that I'm actually looking at where they are and whether I want them to be in that place or not. So I don't think that shadow there is quite dark enough yet, but it will do for the time being. What else have we got going on? We've got a dark shadow in here. Again, there are other pebbles going on underneath, but I'm going to use a little bit of artistic license and get those in. Now, you might find that it's easier to turn your paper around. Because I'm demonstrating for you, I'm going to keep my page the correct way up, but sometimes it's easier to turn your painting surface 90, 100 degrees, 180 degrees even, so that you're not painting across yourself. But for the purposes of today's demonstration, I'm going to leave that where it is. And can you see that's now starting to come forward, starting to sort of pop off the page. I'm definitely getting layers in my pebbles now. Now the last simple shadow that I want to get in is this one. So let's work that up into those corners. In the photograph it's really nice and easy to see. Can pull that across. Ooh, let's sharpen that up a little bit. Pull that across and blend that out a little bit into those other shapes. And there we go. You can start to see how that is really starting to emerge now. They look a bit pudding-like at the moment, but that's very much okay. This one I'm not overly happy with up there. There's lots of things that I'm really desperate to tweak now, but the next port of call for me is definitely getting some grey spatter on there so that I can build my shadows up over the top. So let's revise that spatter technique again. I'm going to fill my brush up. This is the number 6 brush with the Jane's grey colour, and over the top concentrating on those stones that have really got quite a lot of texture. So that's that one, that one. You can be quite accurate with this really. You need some in that top left hand corner. I'm moving my hand around so that I don't get the same mark all the time. Let's do a little bit more. Maybe just a tiny touch of it down here to balance it up. And then if there's any areas of that I think need to be softer, I can take my spray bottle in and I can just give them a slight spritz. You don't need an awful lot of water. You just need enough to make the little spots move, and you can go back in with your kitchen roll to tidy them up. So here's my painting now, all beautifully dry. I can wipe my hand over the surface and not be afraid that anything is going to move. And I'm pretty pleased with it up to this point. And it's one of those stages in a painting that you either love it or hate it. And you're thinking, okay, it's all right. Or, oh gosh, I seem to have done an awful lot of work on it, but it's still not coming together. But this is nowhere near complete, and the reason it's not complete is you've not got any subtlety on it. Yes, you've got some real darks in your cracks and crevices, possibly not quite dark enough yet, but we'll see how it goes. What you haven't got is any kind of sense of one pebble being in front of the other. So here, for example, this needs to have a lovely shadow on it, particularly on the right-hand side of it, to really show how this pebble is in front of it. And if I take you back to the source photograph again, you can very clearly see how those shadows creep around the edges of the pebbles, and it's that gives them their dimension. So that's the bit that we are going to be working on next. I'm going to continue with the Jane's Grey, and I'm going to start working on particularly down here on this pebble. Now bear in mind that any colour, particularly in watercolour, that you have laid down onto the surface, if you wet it again, it is going to reactivate it and it is going to move it to a certain extent. But don't think too hard about it. Just concentrate on the bit that you're wanting to do and work on that. Anything else can be added in later. So we're going to put a really deep shadow in that corner. And then we're going to take our water and we're going to use that water to blend that shadow, as we saw in our source photograph, up and around the edges of our pebble. Now this is going to require me to add a little bit more colour here and there, and of course now I'm starting to hit some of those gesso patches, which are going to increase the amount of texture that I have. And so that's when it becomes deliciously hit and miss. But look, straight away you can see that now this pebble is coming forwards, this pebble is going back, and now it's got more of a side to it. I'm not overly happy with what's happening down here on the edges of this pebble. I've sort of rounded it off a little bit too much, but I can come back to that and sort that out in a minute. I'm going to put a shadow in and creep that up. Again, one of the things that I get asked an awful lot is how to avoid getting just a line, and that's all down to your application. If you only put paint around in a linear fashion on your pebble, that is what you are going to get. So you do need to vary your mark. You do need to, as you can see, as I move my brush around, I'm moving the angle that it's at. I'm trying to make lots of different marks with it and influence it that way. Now I can very clearly see how that shadow is nowhere near deep enough, but there's not much I can do about that at the moment. I need to work on some other things first. Let's work on this creeping shadow down here. Now there's an alternative way that you can do it. You can actually put some water down onto your pebble first, so that when you put your shadow in, and let's just get that one in down here. I know that looks really dark, but don't worry. Can you see how when it starts to hit the water, it starts to diffuse straight away and brings that colour up and around? Now it's entirely up to you which of the two you prefer. I use both, it has to be said, because I think it depends on the mark that I am trying to make. But for that one, it seems to have worked really well. And again, I need to make sure that this pebble is standing out over the top of this one. And so I'm going to run my colour up to the edge and then persuade it across. Now this pebble's really interesting if I have a look at my source photo, because it's full of those lovely kind of cracks and fissures. So rather than just leaving it flat, I'm going to use some of my Jane's Grey dotted in here and there to just show that there are dimples in it. That way you avoid something that I call the rainbow technique, where you've put one colour down and then the next colour and then the next colour, and you're working your way around like that. See, that for me is a much more interesting pebble now. Can you see how these darks that we thought were deep enough in between certainly are not anymore? So those are going to need some working on. But like I say, let's do one thing at a time. So let's work on this one. I'm going to do that same thing, a few little dots of that Jane's Grey, and I'm sure by now you're understanding why I love that colour so much, because it is so soft and subtle, particularly for pebble painting. Seems to be an ideal tone really. Let's work on this one. So put a little bit of water down, pick up just small tiny amounts of that colour and dot that in to give that kind of variegated finish to our pebble. Now what's happening on this one? Right, this needs some attention. So here I'm going to lay some water down onto the edges of the pebble, onto the middle of the pebble, sorry. And then with my dark, I'm going to run that right up to the edge, making sure that my edges are nice and sharp, because then you can see, look how instantly that pebble is now ahead of this one. And we can blend that out. And actually, unusually, this pebble is darker than the one that's behind it. But I daren't mess about with that too much, because otherwise I'm going to have a mismatch. However, can you see here, I've definitely got a mismatch. I can't decide from looking at it which pebble is ahead of the other. So I need to put a shadow on this one. There is a sense of a shadow. Actually, let's do it the other way. There is a sense of a shadow in the photograph. All of this kind of, where you're doing a repetitive subject, it's really useful because it absolutely hones your observation skills, which, as you'll know if you've been painting for a little while, are incredibly important. So there you go, that's better. Now this one is popping out. So can you see how you can make your way around the painting really quite successfully, trying very hard not to panic, trying very hard to get as much of the information in as you dare. I'm going to do this one, but it's all manageable. You don't have to sort of worry about it too much. Let's get that one in, and we can make that surface a little bit more interesting. That's getting somewhere now. Now this one here, that definitely, there's a shadow I'm missing down here, but there's also a shadow that I'm missing along the edge. So I'm going to run a line of water in there, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of that Jane's Grey and wipe that along the edge so that when it hits that water, it diffuses again. Now, is that dark enough? I'm not so sure that it is. So maybe I just need to be a little bit braver with that colour. That's better. I can deepen up some of those things in the next pass of colour. How do we think that's looking? That is better. That is better. And then up here now, in the photograph, this pebble is quite dark, and you've got a shadow that's being thrown pebble-like over the top of this one. Let's show you that in the source photograph and you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, if you look at it abstractly, you will notice that in that top center section, that dark shadow actually looks like a pebble. So if I replicate that, I'm going to be in trouble. So I'm actually going to do the same thing that I did with the others and lay a little bit of water down and then put my Jane's Grey into it, rather than trying to copy the photograph too religiously. So let's get that blended out. That's a little bit ropey on the side, but that's better. Still not quite right. I'll do some tweaking later. And then some of the surfaces of these pebbles here need a little bit of that kind of sculpting with some little bits of shadow here and there, just to make them more interesting. So you can see now how what have we done? 4 passes of paint now. So we did the Quinacridone Gold first, then we did the Cerulean Blue, then we went in between all those cracks and fissures, and now we're starting to work on the shadows. But you can see how those darks were nowhere near dark enough. Now, if we were really brave painters, we might have been able to put those darks in the correct depth of tone right at the start of our pieces. but sometimes you need to build these things up in layers. You can't answer all of the questions that you have about your piece in one go, and this is a prime example of it. It's looking loads better, but it doesn't have that drama. So I'm going to give this another good dry, and then I'm going to come back and fill in all of those cracks. So here we now have our painting nice and dry again, but you can definitely see that those darks on the cracks and fissures in between are not rich enough. I need to be braver with them. Now I do need a little bit of precision, so unusually for me I'm going to switch to a size 4 brush. I don't usually like working with too smaller brushes because I find it makes me way too pernickety about my work, but I think this definitely needs it. And of course, don't forget, this is quite a small painting. So having come this far, I do want a little bit of precision. So let's be really brave. We're going into the Jane's Grey with our size 4 brush. You probably notice that I roll the brush as it hits the colour because I want all of the bristles to be coated in it. And now I'm going to go in with those lovely, the Jane's Grey is such a rich colour that I can work back into those cracks and crevices and start to deepen some of those shadows. I need to be brave. I don't want to rush this part of it. I don't want to go all crazy now, but I do need to get some really nice sumptuous darks in. A tiny bit of water this time to pull that colour out. I can even start to be braver with that blending out by starting to pull it over the top of some of my other pebble shapes. Don't forget that if some of it goes awry or you think, oh, I've pulled that a little bit too far, that's what your kitchen roll is for. So over here, this was one that I really flagged up, wasn't it, for improvement. So let's get the tip of my number 4 brush right into that crack, pulling that dark around the corner. My brush has gone a little bit dry. It's all of these lights that I'm working under. And then let's pull that colour out and around, but it does need to be quite sharp here next to this pebble. So let's use the tip of that number 4 brush to really describe the edge of that one, and that's loads better. Now what that is doing is confusing the difference between that pebble and this one, and actually in the photograph the top of this pebble is slightly darker in colour. So what I'm going to do is pop a little bit of water along that edge, pick up a small amount of my Jane's Grey, and then run that across and over the top just to define that edge. There we go. I'm happier with that now. It's a little bit linear, but I'm just going to live with that. I can probably edit that when I get my gouache out in a second. Now down in here, this needs to be deeper for definite. So let's get brave in with our dark into that kind of triangle that we've got in the corner and pulling it out and around to make sure that we've got a nice sharp shadow in there. Bit of water to soften the edge of it. Having to work quite quickly to blend those shadows out because, like I say, it's quite warm in my studio, but I'm 100% happier with that. Moving that around, that's better, much better. Now we're starting to get that sense of 3 dimension. What else have I got going on? I need this shadow in here to be considerably darker too. It's not too bad, it's almost there, but let's just get it so that it's that little bit richer. Where does this go? This goes up further than I think, actually. Goes all the way up here and comes all the way around this side too. So that's better. That's blending out. Do I want to lose all the yellow in the light of that pebble? Possibly not. So let's add a little bit of water and then just knock it back with our kitchen roll a little bit more. There we go. What else have we got? In here, this needs a deeper shadow in here. So let's get that in. Oh, that's not wet enough, I haven't coated my bristles enough in the paint. Let's get that in on the left hand side with that sharp shadow in there, and it goes up and around and then blends out over this pebble. So let's allow it to do that, and that's why watercolour is so fantastic for a subject like this, because you've got that lovely subtlety. Now I need a deeper shadow on there, but I need to let that one dry first. So let's leave that as it is. And down here I've got a similar problem. Now I have stuck my piece of paper down, but there's no way I can stand on my head to get that shadow in. So let's turn it around, make my life a whole heap easier. And it's this one that we're talking about. So that one needs to run into that little crack. Ooh, using the very tip of my brush and coming out and around. And what's it doing on this one? So it's creeping up the edge of this pebble. So we'll let it blend out that way, and then we'll creep that up and around. How's that looking in real time? That's much better, much better. And if I'm speedy, I can get that moved around and about. Yeah, that's okay. Maybe it needs to be a little bit softer. But you can see, can't you, how a pebble painting is not a quick thing to construct. Certainly not if you want an element of drama in with your work. It really needs quiet consideration and building up in layers. And it's an interesting conundrum for me, because if you know my work, you'll know that I do work quite quickly most of the time, and I don't really enjoy the detail, but just occasionally there is definitely a project that requires it. There's definitely some elements that you think, oh my goodness, I do actually need to spend a bit of time on this. This pebble painting is definitely one of those examples. And I think as well, if you have already purchased my book, you will know that there's a painting in there of the Chrysler Building in New York. And I did that over an entire Christmas, and it took me ages doing all the windows and nearly drove me crazy. But do you know what? It was worth it. It was all that extra little bit of time looking at the precision offset against all the texture. So what am I doing with this? I need to darken that edge a little bit and start to bring that shadow up and around. This pebble really still isn't quite dark enough for me. It's okay, it's just not quite dark enough. So let's rectify that. That's a bit pale. Let's rectify that immediately and get that colour moved. Now you can really start to see where my gesso is working for me, where it's hitting and missing and creating those marvellous textures. So it means that I don't have to do too much work at all. Now down here, I've neglected a little bit of a shadow on this pebble so that this one is standing out, so I can get that in. So I'm really kind of making just little tweaks now. This is always an interesting point with a painting. Do you absolutely religiously copy your source material, or do you start to assess the painting for what it is? And I think I've definitely got to that point with mine, that I could follow those shadows and marks and things that are made on the photograph, and I could start thinking, oh, it's got a slight dimple here and it's got a slight dimple there. But actually, do you know what? I'm assessing it more from the point of view of, does it look right in the painting now? There's some odd things going on this pebble. I'm still not 100% happy with this one, but I've got a few little bits and pieces going in that will hopefully improve that texture. So let's get those last little elements in, and then we can start to work back in with our highlights and get those last little bits of detail in. But I definitely need that all to dry. It's nice and dry again, and so the thing I need to do now is to just work on those last little hints, those little elements that are hopefully really going to bring it to life. So let's take you back to my overhead camera, to my palette cam, where I'm going to show you the consistency of gouache that I like to use for this editing process. So I've squeezed it out onto the palette, and I'm going to use my brush to make it into a sort of single cream consistency. So it's not thick and sticky like it is when it comes out of the tube, but it's not so runny that it stops being nice and white. And I tend to coat my brush with as much as I can, so that when I go back to using it, I'm not constantly going from painting to palette all the time. I've got enough there to do the edit. So here is the painting as it currently stands, and it definitely needs just those little bit of tweaks here and there to start to bring some of the elements forward. So let's start with this big rock. Now I could spatter it if I wanted to, but I can also use the good old-fashioned technique of shoving your finger back in it and creating little kind of highlights here and there to add to that texture. I also need to work on the shape as it comes down to meet the other pebble, which I've never been overly happy with. So we'll get that in. I do like to use my finger to blend it out, and then that is considerably improved. I can increase the amount of highlights that there is up on the top of this rock. I need to knock back a little bit of that line that I put in, because it does look a little bit outlined. And I can probably add some little bits of extra texture down here. You could use a sponge. There's all sorts of ways that you could add your texture back in. I think this could benefit from a little bit of an extra highlight in here. So let's stick that one in. That's a little bit better. And then this, I've got a bit of a spatter mark there that could do with tidying up. That's better. So you can see I'm sort of making my way around, tweaking kind of various elements just to improve the texture or to add some little nuances into the surface. This one I'm really pleased with. This one, is this all right? Yeah, I'm going to ruin it if I do anything else to it, so let's not touch that. This one definitely needs a bit of work. Now I've got a mismatch going on over here between shadow and highlight. So let's pull the edge of that pebble back out again. That's much better. And actually let's push the shape of it a little bit further so that this one definitely looks like it's behind. I think there's probably an issue with the shape of it down in there, but I'll sort that out in a minute. This is fine. Let's use a little bit of dry brush technique over the top to bring that out. And we could do the same up here in the top right hand corner. So I think those are the majority of my highlights taken care of. I definitely just have the odd little bit of tweaked shadow to sort out, and then I think we're pretty much done. Now there's definitely a peculiar shape going on in here, so that needs altering. So let's sort that out so that the shape is improved. So I think that's a case of making it go around the corner a little bit more and possibly up over the top. But I have abandoned my photo reference now. This doesn't look like the photo reference. There's just something odd about it in the painting. So I've altered the painting rather than making it an exact replication. That's much better. I still think this shadow down in here could do with being darker myself. So let's put a little bit of water down, and then let's, oh, do you know what? Unstick it, Ali, and move it, because that will be better and easier. So let's get that in. Oh, be really careful around that shape. I'm glad I've got my trusty size 4 in my hand. Does that look better? Yes, definitely. Definitely. That's brought that forward now. This is coming forward. I still think that could be a little bit deeper in there against this pebble. But I am so conscious of the fact that if I do too much of this, I'm going to be over painting it. So my faffing monitor is definitely set to high alert right now. I don't like this pebble that's up here. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of the cerulean. It's too yellow for me. That's what I don't like about it. I was having a good look at it when I was drying it. And if I knock it back with a little bit of the blue, then hopefully it won't be so prominent and will just sort of be emerging. And do you know what? I think we're pretty much there. I hope that you've enjoyed the techniques that I've shared for my pebble painting today. Do let me know, won't you, via social media if you have had a go yourself. You can find me across all social media platforms. I'm Ali Board Artist. And if you like the kind of painting that I do and you would like to learn more, don't forget my book, A Beginner's Guide to Watercolour with Mixed Media, available from Search Press. And there's lots of other things that you can explore on my website too, which is www.alisonseaboard-fineart.co.uk, or just Google me, Alison Seaboard, and you should be pointed in the right direction. It's a shame that we've had to not be able to join in with Patchings this year due to the circumstances, but I promise you that Patchings 2021, I will be very proud and very honoured to be representing Search Press in their marquee, and I look forward to meeting you all then. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.